We're going to go in alphabetical order, and each of our panelists will share a few points and briefly share these few points with you in order to invite you to conversation afterwards. So each panelist will go, share a little bit, and then if there are any points of commonality or any questions that the panelists have of each other, there'll be space for that after that. And then the main event, which is our conversation together, right? So my hope is that if you have any questions, and I hope you have plenty of questions or reflections, put those in the chat for us, and we will go in turn, or when time comes to open up for a conversation, just kindly raise your hand and we'll go from there. But the point is to have a conversation on this in light of what our panelists are going to be sharing today. So please, come up to the plate and give us your thoughts. And the whole point is, once again, to enrich ourselves and to see where we go from here with this very important question of artificial intelligence and much more. Because if you've read the encyclical, you'll notice that Leo was definitely very capacious. It sounded like, a paper I would critique, actually. If I were still a professor at St. Mary's, for example, I would say to the students, no, that's too long. Too many topics that you're touching on, right? But here, very capacious, but also very necessary, given all the scenarios that we see unfolding before us today. So without further ado, I'm going to open up the floor now to our participants. And once again, we're going to go in alphabetical order. So first up is Nicole Dickens. Let me say a little bit about Nicole before she shares with us. Nicole, with over 20 years of experience in Silicon Valley, bridges the gap between data-driven strategy and human values. As founder of Sodica Inc. and a certified Google generative AI leader, she empowers organizations to leverage LLMs responsibly, blending Fortune 100 expertise with startup agility to drive innovation and impact. Nicole, thank you.
Thank you. The best that ChatGPT can pull on a short notice there. All right. I was starving for this encyclical and for the church to finally step into the conversation with concrete ways to think about this brave new world that we're living in. And I'm glad that the current Pope, I am not Catholic, but he is my Pope, has decided to be as broad as he was in this encyclical, touching on so many of the topics he did, because honestly, AI is in every one of those spaces that he spoke about. And we don't, as a people, understand how pervasive this piece of technology and what this new era is introducing to humanity, if you will. But what reading the encyclical also did for me, and I've shared this a few places already, was remind me of what we lost in the Reformation by pulling away from the Catholic Church. We've lost that continuity. We've lost the wisdom of the ages being added on. And in this encyclical, the first one was only late 18 or early 1890s or something like that, 135 years or so, the first social doctrine encyclica. But not every, but many popes since then have been adding to the doctrine, bringing light to what the current circumstances of their day needed to hear the church speak on. And you see this in this encyclica. He goes back and charts and shares the progression of these encyclica through the ages to today. And that kind of continuity we just don't have in the Protestant church because of how we divide it. And so I was grateful to have that level of wisdom once again shared more broadly, more ecumenically via that encyclical. So that was the first deep blessing for me and be a part of this conversation and reading it for this purpose. Now, my heart around AI has to do with the fact that I think it is a force multiplier to overcome toil, the curse of toil. Post-cross means that the curse should be dead, but we still see its emanations throughout the world. And toil is one of the last places where the enemy, Satan, is uncontested in this world, toil and work and business, where we really just think that it's normal when we know that there was a time pre-fall where there was no toil and work. There was joy and there was collaboration and there was productivity that was eternal in the effort of work. And a few places in the Bay Area, Body of Christ, have begun talking about the concept of AI. And Paul Taylor of Work, Faith, and Tech is in the process of coming up or creating content, teaching around the concept of what it means to be human, as AI is causing people to really answer that question. But in that discussion, we had the blessing to talk about toil and how AI can either eliminate it or just increase toil or shift it around in the work systems of today. And we talked a bit about limitations, and this encyclica, this Pope, really gave the most comprehensive and beautiful discussion on why human limitations are necessary and are good for us. It helps connect us with God in a more honest and truthful way. And in it, it is how we progress into maturity in our humanity. Our soul is developed from our limitations, from our loss, and how we respond and deal to what we lose, and how we respond and deal to disappointments, how we respond and deal with pain, with sickness, and with disease. All of the things that enrich the human experience. And so much about how we're going with technology and AI in particular is about eliminating those things that actually make us beautifully human and beautifully rich, mature, diverse, and experienced humans. And I think that's probably been the best place for me to find content on how to describe why limitations are good for human beings. The tech world, we want to eliminate those limitations at the speed of light, not fully appreciating why they're necessary. And then finally, for me, I love the breakdown of the Catholic social doctrine, the 5 basic points that are important to consider that the Catholic Church is standing their concept of social impact in the world on. The one that I've known in my spirit was the truth, but I didn't have the words for. He gave me, and that is the universal destination of goods. Nowhere I've been quite involved and exposed to much of the faith and work-based organizations in the Bay Area for nearly 30 years now. No one's talking about the concept that all goods ultimately are for all people. And they start from the basic. The Pope starts from the basic that all human beings need access to arable land, water, and air. God created those things for everyone, not just for the wealthy, not just for those who can keep their water cleaner than others. That is supposed to be for all humanity. And that anything that we're producing from this creation and everything that we create is from his original creation, right? We're just processing it into new things. Ultimately should be benefiting all of humanity, not just a select few. Not just the ones who can afford it or ones who's born in the right geographical location to benefit from access to some of these new products. This is the only place in the church I've ever heard anyone talk about that and give it a name and seriously outline what that looks like practically. And I'm grateful for that as well. So those are my 3 points.
Thank you so much, Nicole, for the richness there. And I've taken many notes, and hopefully afterwards we can engage in some conversation with your 3 excellent points. Thank you. Now we're going to move on to Dr. Joe Holland. Joe Holland is an eco-social philosopher and Catholic Christian theologian, exploring the ecological, social, and spiritual breakdown of Western-rooted but now globalized modern industrial colonial civilization, and the philosophical, scientific, and spiritual search for a postmodern, global, electronic, ecological civilization. He is the author of more than 20 books and many articles, as well as a professor, retired, of philosophy and religion. And Joe was actually my professor a long time ago at St. Thomas University in Miami, Florida. and we've shared many spaces. And so it's also an honor to have him here with us and for him to share his thoughts on the encyclical as well as Catholic social teaching, broadly writ. Joe.
Thanks, Cesar. I think I'm most famously known for being Cesar's professor. That would be a legacy I would be happy to leave behind. Cesar mentioned 3 points, or CJ mentioned 3 points. I have 3 points. I just jotted them down when he said that. But that actually worked out pretty well together because they are interwoven. The first is what Nicole was talking about, Catholic social teaching. I think it'd be interesting to locate where this fits in the evolution of Catholic social teaching. Secondly is what I would call the clash of civilizations or conflict of civilizations, and he mentions the civilization of love and so on at the end, which is really where this, what I would call third stage of contemporary Catholic social teaching in the modern period is at, the search for a new civilization. That's quite different than the 2 earlier stages. And a key philosophical issue in that conflict is the issue of transhumanism and posthumanism. Those seem to me very central things. So if there's more time, I'd love to talk. But just to give you the lay of the land on Catholic social teaching quickly, Catholic social teaching, the Catholic Church has a distinct intellectual and spiritual tradition, but especially intellectual. The classical Christianity for the first millennium, was really grounded philosophically in Plato and Neoplatonism, particularly through monasticism. Then in the Middle Ages, there was a Renaissance led out of African Muslims in the south of Spain in cooperation with Jews and Catholic Christians. Thomas Aquinas came out of that, around an Aristotelian Renaissance, around Aristotle, who had been rejected all through the first millennium. That was quite remarkable, and Aristotle is quite different from that, much more materialist in the material world. The Reformation, I think, in some ways went into nominalism, but in other ways it went back to Platonism too. But Catholicism hung in there in this Aristotelian and then Thomist thing and Neo-Thomism. But one important viewpoint from the viewpoint of colonialism was the school of Salamanca around the time of the Spanish Conquista, which condemned the Spanish Conquista of the Americas, even said it was an unjust war. They wound up in a backhanded way kind of justifying it, but the ground was quite remarkable, and that's an important stage, I think, in the tradition. But I told you there are 3 stages. They correspond to really 3 industrial revolutions. The first one was the factory revolution in the 19th century, where the workers became cogs and human bodies in an assembly line, not much machinery, but this assembly line of workers during laissez-faire capitalism. And that was the first stage. You don't hear much about it. The scholars don't emphasize it because the Catholic Church, as I mentioned earlier, before everybody got here maybe, was totally, bishops and the popes were totally opposed to the modern world. They opposed railroads, vaccinations, all kinds of stuff. It was crazy. They were defending the landed aristocracy, and that failed miserably. Leo XIII was remarkable. He launches the second stage, accepting the Industrial Revolution and modern liberalism. And his strategy is basically not reactionary, but moderately progressive, but not radical. Against communism, Marxism, but for reform liberalism. And of course, there are other forces besides Catholic social teaching, the progressive movement, the Protestant social gospel. They're all coming together, and they create this second reform of capitalism during the time of the machine revolution, which I won't have time to go into, but that was different than the factory revolution. The third stage begins with John the 23rd, and it is overlapping with the new electronic revolution, out of which artificial intelligence is a further stage within the larger electronic revolution. So this is the third stage of Catholic social teaching. The first stage made the worker a cog in a wheel. The second one tried to replace the muscles of the worker with the machines, and the workers did dirty, heavy work, but the machines were the power. And now it's replacing the mind of the worker, because the mind of the worker played an important role in the second stage. So this is a whole sequence. So the key question becomes the dignity of the human person underlying all of this. And I won't get into that now, but that's very foundational. That issue, the dignity of the human person, then leads to in this third stage, beginning with John the 23rd, remember, Leo was pro-reform of liberalism, anti-Marxism. Since John the 23rd, the view is that modern ideologies, liberalism with its liberal capitalism and Marxism with its scientific socialism or communism, are both bankrupt. But the people in them are good, and we need a dialogue with both in search for a new civilization, which, by the way, according to John, would be global, planetary civilization, and especially with the global South. That's the big shift around the beginning of the second half of the 20th century, and we're still in that. Transhumanism, I think, and posthumanism bring the whole question of the human person center stage, and that's, I mean, we could really spend some time talking about that. There is coming in a whole second wave of eugenics, as perhaps some of you know, which is very threatening. I think we could see Elon Musk's getting rid of the Department of USAID as the beginning of a second wave of eugenics. An article I read just the other day, I think it was in the UK Guardian, they're projecting that within 4 years that will cause something like around, if I remember correctly, like 6 million deaths. It's the beginning. They don't want those people anymore, particularly of non-white colored skins. There's a whole new eugenics movement with the new right, and I think that the encyclical does not address that adequately. But the new right, I think, needs to be placed center stage. It's very frightening. It's very powerful, very strong, very pervasive, and very dangerous.
Thank you, Joe, for your reflections. Lots there as well. Really appreciate that. And once again, if you have any questions, comments as we move along, please remember to type those in the chat box for us, so we can make sure to attend to those and open up the conversation after our panelists share their comments. Thank you, Joe. Moving right along to Jimmy Lin, who's the Chief Scientific Officer of Freenome, a biotech leader employing intelligent screening for cancer detection. Prior to the private sector, Jimmy led the intramural clinical genomics program at the National Cancer Institute at the NIH. At Johns Hopkins University and Washington University in St. Louis, he spearheaded the computational analyses of the first ever exome sequencing studies in multiple cancer types. Jimmy was a 2016 Senior TED Fellow and is the founder and president of the Rare Genomics Institute. With that, thank you, Jimmy, for joining us, and looking forward to your comments.
Thank you so much. And it's hard to follow experts in Catholic social teaching as a non-Catholic, but I was really blessed by the Pope's teaching. I was trained at Reformed Theological Seminary, studying specifically looking at Bavinck's theological anthropology and how that sort of affects AI. And I think there has been so much sort of coherence of sort of biblical teaching that comes from the scriptures. So my 3 points are pretty simple. Think very scientifically. My first point will come from chapters 1 and 2, thinking about the nuance that the Pope was able to do. My second point will come from chapter 3, talking about the impact of technology. And my third point will come from chapters 4 and 5, in terms of looking at the importance of humanity. So first point. Chapters 1 and 2, for those who come from an academic tradition, it's a kind of like a literature review of looking at what has been written. And then a good chapter 1 is sort of that literature review of history. And chapter 2 is a sort of an overview, a reemphasis of Catholic social teaching. For those who haven't read Catholic social teaching, it's a great reintroduction to be able to do that. Those are the first 2 chapters. I was in conversation with different Catholics who've been advising the Vatican on some of these issues. And there was fears on what the Pope was going to come out because there was different factions sort of speaking about that. And because there were a lot of nuances that these chapters sort of had to sort of weigh. And when it came out, I think many of us were very, very elated and relieved that the Pope was able to sort of draw a very clear balance between things, a couple of here, right? So one thing he could have done is focus mostly on the political versus the spiritual. He could do very one way or the other. He tried to really sort of be able to say to both. He balanced the use of technology, be able to say that it's coming versus also just avoiding it altogether there to be able to sort of balance that. He also was able to balance the essence, sort of talking about Catholic social teaching, but keeping it ecumenical to start this as a conversation with humanity as a whole there. And then that whole emphasis of human dignity, the balance of it just becoming sort of secular humanism, but also, and that's a danger, but also centering it on specifically our imago Dei, created an image of likeness of God. So in a sense, actually, this is a pretty phenomenal document that there were so many sort of balances that the Pope had to do. And again, there could be a lot of critique from many sides, but ultimately, I think it really steered very balance of these different areas there. And again, I think like Joe said, and Nicole said, right, this is square right down the fairway in terms of Catholic social teaching and emphasizing that and really being able to show that there. So that was pretty amazing to be able to do that. And then all the aspects of Catholic social teaching for the emphasis of of the common good, subsidiarity, solidarity. In the Reformed tradition, we have something called sphere sovereignty, which is sort of more horizontal versus the subsidiarity. But again, the importance of the people being most affected by having a say into that there, and also focusing on the rights of the poor, of the worker there. So again, that first two chapters were amazing in terms of really sort of putting that in context and applying what also, again, the richness of Catholic social teaching for someone who's outside of that tradition too. Chapter 3 was really good, at least for me as sort of a builder is really sort of looking at AI and thinking about the image, right? There was a clear image of Babylon versus Nehemiah about what are you going to be building there, and calling not just for the companies to be, to make sure that AI is aligned, but calling people to be contributory to that. And that's why some of us have been working on the Center for Ethical Intelligence, really thinking about how to build AI in a way that it has moral to a pluralistic society there. So that's important there. And I think the Pope isn't just saying that, at least my interpretation is, oh, the lab's going to build their AI, and then we're either going to reject it or we're going to run away. But for him to invite Anthropic's Chris Olah to be participatory to that context is really, again, is involving Christians within that building, especially using that concept there. And in fact, I've heard already some stories of Catholics and non-Catholics, like other Christians, who are thinking, am I building for the Tower of Babel, or am I building with Nehemiah in terms of the Jerusalem there? So I think there's the call of building, which is very, very important there. So as Christians, not necessarily just sort of sit on the sidelines, but being involved with AI labs and technologies, and to be able to be one there. Last point is chapters 4 and 5 is really sort of thinking about humanity and culture and emphasizing human dignity and the value of work there. And I think what's really exciting there is there's there's a lot of talk about technocratic sort of centralization of power there, which I won't talk about. But in Silicon Valley, there's this view of if you have UBI, everybody can sit on the beach and sip pina coladas and enjoy life. And that's the enjoyment of life. And what's important is right now, like, I think we were called to work, and work is not a curse, right? We were called to work even before the fall. And the beauty of us humans created to work and the dignity of work, even in that context, is pretty amazing to continue to sort of focus. In the Protestant tradition, we talk about the priesthood of all believers, that everybody is able to glorify God in their work. But again, sort of painting that future picture of humanity, is beautiful even in its limitations. It's an ontological essence in terms of its dignity, but also being called to work. So even if AI is able to do everything, we are still able to glorify God through our work. There again, from my tradition, from sort of the Kuyperian perspective, to glorify God in all we do, and that view of the work is, again, to emphasize the not only the needs of the emphasis of the worker and the laborer, but even in the future where our work is something of great value that we're called to, versus something that we're just going to avoid if AI can just do our work there. So those are 3 points. Coming from a non-Catholic view, I was really, really blessed by it and excited that this has started a global conversation of the Christian faith and technology. And for those who are in Silicon Valley, we've had more spiritual conversations than ever before in this context, and we really praise God for that.
Thank you, Jamie, for your comments and for centering theological anthropology, right, as a necessary category to explore. Once again, looking forward to the conversation after. Thank you for your comments. And last but definitely not least, Reverend Dr. Neil Pressa serves as the executive presbyter of the San Jose Presbytery, a regional body of the Presbyterian Church. He holds affiliate faculty appointments with Fuller Theological Seminary, as well as with Union Theological Seminary, and is a senior fellow with the Center for Pastor Theologians. Dr. Pressa has served 2 pastorates in New Jersey and Southern California. He also currently serves on behalf of the Presbyterian Church USA on the World Council of Churches. Dr. Pressa, take it away.
CJ, thank you. And again, thank you to New College Berkeley and Craig Wong for sponsoring this conversation. Being the last in the expertise and the smarts of Nicole and Joe and Jimmy, I am going to offer my humble 3 points and see, where it resonates and where it might offer some additional insight to the wisdom that colleagues have offered. First, let me say that in this region of our San Jose Presbytery, just north of us, of course, Silicon Valley, and the annual Stanford Emerging Technologies Review, co-chaired by Condoleezza Rice, noted in its review this year of artificial intelligence, noting that as a foundational technology, that AI has the potential to transform societies, economies, and politics worldwide. And so for Pope Leo to devote his first encyclical on this issue, the existential opportunities, but also the existential threats, is timely. So the other side of the coin, from a non-faith perspective, SETR, the Stanford Emerging Technologies Review, gives an affirmative voice in the pervasiveness, the ubiquity, and the volume and velocity of artificial intelligence. And all we have to see, for example, in the last 3 days from the IPO of SpaceX on Friday up to today, the market cap from 1.6 trillion to 2.4 trillion today. All we have to do is just look at that and say, yes, this is a timely and salient issue. Let me also add as well, from an ecumenical perspective, that Pope Leo the 14th was not the first to address this. We do have to recognize His All Holiness, the Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew I, who in December 2024 called the world's attention to AI and calling for a faith voice in saying how AI has inherent risks. But that, as Magnifica Humanitas notes, that it's not technocratically determinative. In other words, that technology uh, doesn't determine the outcome. There is a place for human agency. And so, thus, we must act now, right? We must act in order to make the right decisions and the right choices that will govern the pathway and the trajectory of this frontier technology. So, here are my 3 points: solidarity, subsidiarity, and civilization of love, which parallels the prophetic call of Micah, do justice, love mercy, walk humbly, which parallels the gifts of 1 Corinthians 13, faith, hope, love, which parallels the theological centerpieces that Pope Leo points to: Trinity, incarnation, and humanity. So first on solidarity, I am grateful that Pope Leo, that the Holy Father, calls us to do this, to pay attention to how artificial intelligence, those who design it, those who use it, all of us, must pay attention to the issue of solidarity, which is to do justice, to pay attention to how does this frontier technology inure or drive us to being in solidarity with our common humanity on planet Earth of 7 billion people, where access to this technology is limited to just a few. How does this gift, if you will, this innovation through human intellect How does it drive our human population, our human family towards solidarity with the poor, solidarity with the marginalized, solidarity uh, with those who are, as he describes, as those who are excluded versus those who are included? Second, on subsidiarity, and on this point, human dignity. Subsidiarities, the principle of subsidiarity that focuses on human agency, that focuses on individuals and communities, not to be subsumed into the state, but how the state uh, enables human freedom, how the state can support the that which happens on the individual, on the family, on the social level. From a Presbyterian Reform perspective, I offer the lens of the Accra Confession in 2004, which was the first time that a faith community, a Reformed confession, spoke about the social obligations of the social obligations of the economy. The Accra Confession that was drafted and approved in Accra, Ghana, in 2004 at the General Council of the then World Alliance of Reformed Churches, spoke presciently and urgently and cogently on the need for faith to lean into the conversations around commodification of people, commodification and monetization of the environment, and how we need to pay attention to an overemphasis on profits and talk about people, the dignity of people. And so, subsidiarity and the principle of subsidiarity, how is it that we can lift up voices, lift up perspectives, lift up efforts in dignifying human beings in our human family. And so third is a civilization of love. And the emphasis that Pope Leo devotes to this, that we are all, we hope, striving for a world where love God, love neighbor and stranger is not only values in which we live, but that it is part of who we are. This is why we have been created in the image of God. How is it that we can cultivate more and more using AI as a tool, um, as a means, as one of several means, in order for us to cultivate among us more a civilization of love where we look out for each other, where we care for each other, where we care for the environment, where we care about our common future and for future generations. And so with that, CJ, and with that, and I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your comments. And I think a wonderful place to end, right, our collective reflections here. There is something I want to also recognize here, which is that Pope Francis actually in De Lexit Nos, his final encyclical, mentioned, right, started kind of laying the framework for this conversation of AI and particularly algorithms. You know, he approached it in a more old school way. But a beautiful passage in there is where he discusses this concept of what it means to be human. And for Francis, what it means to be human is to remember, right, things from childhood, to remember, you know, your grandma, the way she bakes something, or, you know, to remember the birds and the way they sing, right? And very romantic kind of application of what it means to be human. But Leo, I hear, right, puts it in tension and says we need a dose of healthy realism here, right, in terms of what it means to be human as well as our faults, our complexities. Not that Francis didn't recognize those, of course he did. But there is also this kind of theological anthropology that I think Leo is proposing here, which is a little bit more nuanced, right, than what church teaching, at least in the past, has been comfortable kind of proclaiming here. And so, with that, I want to open up for conversation among the panelists first, and then we can get to questions, comments, concerns from our beloved audience here. So, do the panelists have anything that they want to say to each other, or any points of convergence, disagreements, etc.?
CJ, if I may, I was fascinated by Joe, your in your second point about clash of civilizations, and I couldn't help but think of the late Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sacks in his book shortly after 9/11, Clash of Civilizations, that dignifying difference. Can you say a little bit more about what you were talking about, the clash of civilizations is in that?
Uh, sure, Neil. And just a personal note, do you happen to know the head of the presbytery from Philadelphia, Ruth Santana?
Dear friend, beloved
She's an
friend,
old
yes.
friend. Okay, yeah, a friend from her Italy days. But anyway, and another little note. Excuse me for taking up time. And I have to thank Jimmy, my wife, back in 2022, came down with acute myeloid leukemia. Her oncologist, within 1 week, had the genome of her cancer, and they were able to give targeted therapy for the 3 specific mutations that they had. It's absolutely extraordinary. And thanks to folks like you, she's in complete remission now, Jimmy. And praise the Lord. Okay. I lost my track again. I'm sorry. Cesar, I'm going to go back again to you.
It was the question was in terms of the clash of civilizations.
Oh, clash of civilizations. Yeah. Since John the 20th, again, the first stage of Catholic social teaching was opposed to modern liberal capitalist civilization. Wanted to go back to the old aristocracy. From Leo on, fight the Marxists, but help the liberals reform capitalism. From John the 23rd on, there are problems with Marxism and with liberalism. And this is a different tradition coming, as I said, through Aquinas and earlier out of Aristotle. And he begins to call for a new civilization, but inviting people from both sides and from all world religions in on a dialogue to do that. And the successive popes are, his successor, Paul VI, then coined the term, phrase, civilization of love, which Leo picks up on again. Yeah, but the problem is the dehumanization of the human person by both these modern ideologies, to which now we have to add, a little bit late, but nonetheless effectively, with Laudato Si, the devastation of the global ecosystem as well. This is not in Catholic social teaching, just my own philosophical analysis. Underlying the modern world, and this is pretty clear from scholarship, the grounding philosopher is Epicurus, an anti-spiritual, atomistic, mechanical philosopher of pure materialism. It's very clear. These are 2 sympathetic writers, if you want to, I'll just mention to them. A brilliant scholar, Catherine Wilson, Canadian, taught in New York, UK, and Scotland. Epicureanism at the origins of modernity. All the founders of modern science were steeped in Epicureanism. That's where we get the atomic theory from, by the way. The problem with it is, and Stephen Goldblatt, the swerve, that's something from Epicureanism too. Both very sympathetic to Epicureanism, but they do show it is the underlying philosophy of the modern world. It is an anti-spiritual, purely material spirituality philosophy that is atomistic and mechanical. A lot of people are not aware of that, and many of the major figures in Catholic social teaching don't seem to be aware of it. They're critiquing it on grounds that really confirm the presence of Epicureanism, but they're not aware of the grounding philosophy of it there. So I say it's a fundamental philosophical clash. The same, not just liberalism, but Marxism too. By the way, Marx wrote his doctoral dissertation at the University of Berlin on Epicurus and the swerve. By the way, he liked the swerve. That was the atoms had a sort of freedom to do certain things, and Democritus. So we need to go to that ground. The personalism that the Catholic social teaching comes from certainly has fundamentally biblical roots, and the Latin phrase imago Dei, but it really became powerful in the middle of the 20th century with a figure named Emmanuel Mounier, who was a young lay Catholic philosopher, graduated from the Sorbonne, who founded a journal in Paris in the first half of the 20th century called Esprit. All subsequent Catholic thinkers and Catholic social thought around personalism was powerfully influenced by Mounier. And I'm finishing a little book about him that I'll publish pretty soon. So this clash between the human person and this mechanical atomistic, where the atoms can simply be disassembled and reassembled in any way, as we sometimes speak today of liquid modernity. It's completely fluid, scrambled, and there's no substance, no essences to it. That leads to a kind of Nietzschean triumph of the largest atoms. the will to power of those who have the most power. And we're seeing a kind of Nietzschean nihilistic triumph in the incredible concentration of wealth in the global economy in a small number of individuals who are really sucking the life out of the earth and sucking the life out of local communities across the planet. So that's a very frightening clash. I think we can expect to see this clash of civilizations. The modern, I would call it materialistic, anti-spiritual civilization of mechanical atomism versus this search for a new ecological personalist. And by the way, Mounier, at the end of his life, turned to, on personalism, turned to Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, and he wove his personalism together with the evolving teleological and panpsychic cosmology of Teilhardian evolution. So we have the other path that I've was that's the Catholic path. The Protestant path is through process Whitehead and process thought. Those are two important paths converging into the philosophical ground for a new civilization. There, of course, will be many others from other areas of the world, but that's the fundamental clash, I think. I hope that helps, Cesar. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, I think that was once again in terms of the clash of civilizations. I think most people will think automatically of Samuel Huntington, right, and the clash of
yeah.
What you're speaking of is at a deeper level. It's a philosophical, civilizational, deeply held, belief system that really transcends in some ways people's ethnicities, skin colors. Right? It's very insidious, which Leo talks about at the end with colonialism, and I think that's a good point to bring up here with artificial intelligence as a way of colonizing, right? In a very subtle way, under the guise of progress and trying to help others. But as we see, once the concentration of who owns these tools and who benefits from them is actually quite limited, notwithstanding propaganda to the contrary. So thank you for your comments there. I want to go back to something Nicole said earlier. Nicole, you said that souls and how we respond to pain is an indication of what it means to be human here, right? And you also touched on limitations and the necessity for restraint. Leo, in his encyclical, paragraph 15, he basically says, ours is the pressing duty to remain profoundly human, right? In light of all this. And then he says, of course, one way to remain human is by embracing this finitude, right? That we don't want to embrace as a civilization. Can you speak a little bit more to that, or also invite the panelists into conversation on that question? But how do we embrace our finitude, and how do we do it in light of constant messaging, what I call chatter, the loud noise outside, right? That tells us that limiting things is bad, not only for you, but for your family, future generational wealth, et cetera, et cetera. So how can we work that into our ways of life?
So I think Leo nails it towards the end of the encyclical. But he talks about, and I'm glad he used, and you remind me of the word finitude, which means we have a beginning. But for those of us who are part of the family of believers, we no longer have an end, right? Our triune God has no beginning, no end. He's uncreated. They are uncreated, if you will. But we have a starting point that has no end involved, and that our limitations actually help us understand the value of our place in creation and the value of the fact that we were created in the first place. We have to deal with what we cannot control, which is the opportunity to surrender to the one who controls it all. And the Pope, towards the end, talks about how in his discussions of post-humanism and transhumanism, that we're trying to transcend our limitations, the Tower of Babel analogy he made, by our own efforts. When Jesus took on flesh and then solved the problem of sin and death for us, thereby deifying our humanness, we're trying to get to the same end, if you will. One Tower of Babylon in our own strength, another via the Paschal mystery and the life, death, and resurrection of Christ. Our limitations help us understand aspects of the nature of God that we would not otherwise develop on our own. And he talks about that in paragraphs 119 and 120 around without suffering, we will never move towards compassion. We would never understand the need for empathy, right? And some of the ways the concept of empathy has been attacked in recent years is coming out of the mouths of people who've just had too much luxury and too much too much time on their hands that they can't put themselves in someone else's shoes and understand their pain and realize there's a more excellent way, if you will. It's indulgence that creates that desire that all of a sudden now empathy is evil. Empathy is bad. Just the way we're thinking about limitations is a bad thing. Limitations are a bad thing. And so he buttresses against the progress, the expectation of human beings to mature, to become better, to transform. And the old folks from my spiritual upbringing refer to it as sanctification, right? Transformation and sanctification. That our limitations are the things that make us want to become better human beings. And by experiencing life, by loving and losing, by disappointments, by all of those things we call limitations or negative things, they mature us into the more compassionate and empathic people we were designed to be, right? I mean, there was no more empathic than Christ, who decided he could have done this. He's God from heaven. He put on human flesh, and not just human flesh. He came as an infant through someone's birth canal. So that means he's vulnerable. Those first 12 years, you know, the Hebraic, you're not an adult till you're 12. He's vulnerable to a world and principalities that want to see him dead. He chose every step of the way to empathize what it means to be human post-fall and prove how we can get back what was lost in chapter 3 of Genesis. He's the picture of empathy. And because he chose to suffer, because he chose to be vulnerable, because he chose to put himself physically, emotionally, and spiritually in our place to liberate us. And not understanding our limitations, we don't see the value of the Paschal mystery. We don't see what the Father and Son, what it cost them to get us this reconnection back to our original design of chapters 1 and 2 of Genesis, if we don't feel the pain a little bit. It's my theory. It's just my theory. I do not have seminary training here. I'm an AI practitioner, but it's always been my theory that we lost paradise because it was too easy and we had no opposition, right? We didn't have enough life experience to understand the value of what God had given us by placing us in the garden and making us his personal companion daily, giving us good work to do that was going to have eternal results and impact. And, you know, from you know, our first day of life, well, our first day, I guess, was the Sabbath, but our first day of work, the day after the Sabbath, right? We couldn't appreciate that without the loss. I think that's why he risked it all, because he knew it would sharpen our appreciation, deepen our ability to love as he loves by going through the dark valley, coming with his help, coming back into the light and the fullness of what he always intended for us as his creation and his image bearers.
Thank you for your comments. Really appreciate it.
You need the dark to see the light.
And I think
that probably was a shorter way of saying that.
And I think that's also in line with his Augustinian kind of theological anthropology that we see there, right? So yeah, thank you for your comments on that. Of course, if the audience has any comments on that, I also welcome them. I also want to give a shout out to Dr. Michael Barham, who's here with us, also good friend and former colleague. Good to see you here. Please chime in if you have also any contributions there. So at this point, mindful of our time, we only have a few minutes left here. So mindful of our time, I want to see if any of the other panelists have maybe a concluding thought or something before we open it up to our audience.
CJ, there's a question there in the chat from Abin Das, who's a candidate for ordination in our presbytery, and he asked there a question referencing paragraph 173 about Pope Leo's note there about how can technology, uh, what is this, not be a new form of slavery? And what are some practical and ecumenical ways in which we can free a new generation? If I could offer just two brief points, connecting it to Nicole's point about being human and we are not God, we are creatures. Um, Recall that at the end of Psalm 46, be still and know that I am God. There is a Selah there that believed to be right, that musical note or that note for the assembly, the gathered assembly, to pause, to consider. And I think that I think is a very practical way that where technology seeks efficiency. My wife reminds me that we are not human doings, we are human beings. And Psalm 46 and reminds us that to be still. We are human beings at the end of the day. We won't complete many of the tasks that we set out. And if we see AI as being helping us be more efficient so we could do more in hopes of doing what, of being more accepted or feeling that we belong more, that that we'll be loved more. Psalm 46 is a reminder, Selah, pause, that we are creatures created in the image of God with finitude, with limitations, to be embraced and to be celebrated. One practical thing, there was a episode in on NPR that talked about how let's get off of our devices and the keystrokes on a keyboard, and let's recover writing, the simple act of writing, picking up a pen. By doing that, by note taking with a pen, our the neurons help us to remember more of what we're learning. And so over reliance upon technology like AI, where we want to be efficient to do more, perhaps we need to recover our humanness in such practical things as that, as simple taking notes by the pen and being more disciplined. And, you know, at the end of uh, this Zoom conversation, closing the laptop and taking a walk outside, something so practical like that, to be human beings and not human doings.
Mm, I think that's wonderful. Yes, absolutely. And the unplugging, that's something that is crucial. And I think also related to your question, if I may just quickly pose a question, I guess, for us here. Paragraphs 143 to 147, Leo discusses the central role of schools and education. And I think, a question I got from his paragraphs here is, can they truly overcome the technocratic paradigm? Can our schools, right, overcome the technocratic paradigm that he is critiquing? And also, what again of the colonial legacies tied to these places? But more importantly here, I think is, our schools are receiving funding for particular programs that are catering to this technocratic paradigm, right? And of course, they're necessary. Students need to be well versed in, of course, the tools of the economy. But what are the roles of our schools, right? Particularly our universities, our middle schools, our high schools, in shaping the next generation that Leo says, right, should remain profoundly human, but perhaps feel because of the messaging that it's utterly impossible, right, to not engage in some type of transhumanism or, some type of AI led, right, initiative in terms of economy, outlook, philosophy, religion. So just wanted, I guess, open up with that for our panelists or anybody in the audience.
Maybe I'll just add some quick thing as a non-Catholic, but just sort of, even the Silicon Valley region, as our kids were applying to high schools, the number of Catholic schools in this area, some of them even from the same order there. And then sort of a quick look up is every year, 60 million students are educated through the Catholic system. 60 million. There are over 200,000 education institutions there. And again, that legacy of teaching and, within just the Catholic systems, right? We're not talking about sort of Protestant school as well. So I think the Catholic Church has enormous sway potentially In that part. Of course, there's the public school system and others, but even in that, like for the Pope to be able to come out and emphasize the importance of teaching and giving the scope of the Catholic Church, there's scarcely any where in the world you can't go without, be able to be involved in that. So I think, and it's so practical. I really appreciated that those paragraphs of like, the very, very practical things that was emphasized there. So I really appreciate that sections.
Thank you, Jimmy. Okay. At this point, if there are no comments on that, then now we can turn to our chat. Okay, so I'll let my colleague, Greg, our fearless leader here, take that section away in terms of which questions or the order of the questions and how we can move forward with that. So turn it over. Or I can actually, let me see, I can go here with a question. Okay, so one question is, how can people of faith influence big tech to think about deeper social implications beyond the economic bottom line? Big question for our panelists.
Yeah, so again, I'm working with a group of Christians. Many of them do come from big tech, thinking about what are ways for us to be able to really help steer the large language models there, and what language models are used to train for are large data sets, right? In order for it to get good at math, it has the math Olympiad test to be able to do that. In order for cars to be good, there's all these cars driving around collecting data. Recently, they've been focusing on finance, but there's not a large data set for morality, for values, for highly curated ways, right? All it has is just sort of the entirety of the internet, including all the good and the bad, all the the Reddit threads. So we're working with people coming from we have people from Google DeepMind, from people from Anthropic, people from Meta and others who are people of faith, and we're thinking about how do we become builders of this? How do we able to sort of create these data sets and benchmarks and evals for that can be used in a large scale open source model that can be used for AI labs. It was a pipe dream. Maybe about a year ago, we started these efforts, and some of you may have seen that in the news that even Anthropic has now invited us. We were sort of part of that discussion with Anthropic, talking about morality there. Was sort of covered in Washington Post. So the labs, we never have thought that the labs would ever listen to us, but they invited us, and those conversations are there. So our goal is, again, we're also working with the Catholic Church. Jokingly we say, I'm going to go to the Pope and like send us 1,000 of your top ethicists, philosophers, and priests, and let's create these data sets together. We're trying to also think about doing this in with other religions and also within Protestants. A little bit harder to organize Protestants, but we're trying there. But I think the main thing is instead of critiquing from afar, let's build these data sets so that the labs can have them. Because again, many of the AI safety institutions within the different nations there don't want to touch it because it's a third rail to sort of decide whose values are going to be there. The companies definitely don't want to do it. So it's up to sort of the individual groups that are doing that. So we're working with Christians, we're working with other faiths for them to be able to create these data sets. So then, when you tell a language model, especially not even question and answer, but also act on your behalf and is agentic, when you say you want it for a certain value set, whether from Christian, Protestant side, or Catholic, or Mormon, or Islam, those data sets will be available there. So I think there's ways that Christians can start sort of building there. I think that was sort of the emphasis of sort of chapter 3 in the cyclical there. So I think, and then there's many people also building, downstream of the models too. Involved in a community called Praxis there, and many companies are being started. Also, Sprout Labs Christians are building on top of the language models as well. So again, I think the key here is to think about Tower of Babel and let's not build there. And what does it mean to be like Nehemiah in terms of looking at diverse voices and building for not just Christians but also for the common good. And that was what the encyclical was also very helpful in. It's not just Christian apps, but apps that celebrate human flourishing and the common good.
Okay. Thank you, Jimmy. Does any other panelists want to?
Yes. So Denise's question actually is going after a bigger question of how do we switch focus from just the single bottom line one to what people were talking 20, 30 years ago, a triple bottom line, not just your profit, but the impact on the world and the people, your sphere of influence, and the impact on a future as well? Are you creating something that's sustainable and long term and will be there for other people? And it's good that they are there for other people. And my response might not be the most popular one, but you're talking about massive change of how change to capitalism, the concept of capitalism. What you're describing is not a laissez-faire model, and that is how capitalism still works, at least in the West. Of the markets will sort themselves out. We don't have to get involved too much. Humans don't have to intervene too much. And the bottom line is the pattern has always been there. It's just, do we want to do it? And that is, and you mentioned the women who stood up about the ethical concerns were fired. Sacrifice is still part of the process of having impact in the world for the cause of Christ in it, right? We still have to be ready. We can't love our lives unto death. And we have to still be willing as employees to stand up for what is right and risk everything, to stand up for his name and be willing to risk everything. Now, there's a couple of ways people decide to do that. There are people who decide one track is they're going to get along till they're long enough to have influence. They get to an EVP, VP status, and there make changes. But then that process leaves you open to the time that takes. How much will you change in the doing, right? In the trying to hang out. The second one is the employee standing up and taking the hit and then getting pushed out of the process and therefore can't have any more influence, or not the same kind of influence if they went along with things that were counter to their ethical viewpoints to stay a little bit longer. The third way could be a hybrid of either of the two ones I just described, or something totally new, but it requires a lifestyle of being fully submitted to Holy Spirit and let him navigate you. You look at our scriptures and you look at the Josephs and the Davids and the Moses of the world. We can argue they didn't get everything right or they didn't do everything right, but ultimately they got their life's work done because they followed the Spirit and did what he asked them to do in that moment. Certain moments, they didn't make a big deal about stuff that were diametrically opposed to what God's teachings would say. But when it counted and when the Spirit needed them to act in a certain way or methodology, they did. I mean, Daniel didn't blast Nebuchadnezzar for being a heathen. He served him as his advisor. And when he needed wisdom from God, he let them know it was from God, that he was going to interpret dreams and things like that. Life in the Spirit is the way to have the greatest impact for the cause of Christ in the world than any other way. And it's just a decision of living a Spirit-led life instead of a Christian humanist life where, yes, there's a God, but the decisions are really up to me. And I think that might be a place to start thinking about how to have impact that's going to have eternal fruit within these tech companies if you are working in such a company now.
Okay, thank you. Again, mindful, I wish we had more time, right? Conversation, I feel, is just getting started in some ways. And so I'm going to be mindful here once again of the 5 minutes we have, and I'm going to blend some questions together and hopefully have a good closing conversation here. So the concerns that I'm seeing here in our questions seem to be practical, right? Practical concerns. So I'm going to start with one here. The encyclical brings up so many questions, right? As we've been saying, it's a very capacious, broad encyclical. What theological or ethical questions do you think local congregations are best prepared to take on now, right? At least in the immediate. And a related question to that is, once again, what do spiritual leaders need, right, in order to be equipped or trained to meet this technological moment of which Pope Leo speaks about often here, right? So those are very, very broad questions for a very broad encyclical, but I think these are great concerns in order to close our conversation out. So with that, I invite panelists, audience, to reflect on these practical concerns. Yes, Joe, you're muted.
Yeah, I'm looking for my unmute button. Sorry. One of the problems, I think, with the present phase of Catholic social teaching from John the 23rd on up until including this encyclical, in contrast with the Leonine encyclicals from 1891, well, even earlier forward, the Leonine, what I would call the Leonine strategy, had a very well thought out action strategy that was quite practical and effective. I'm not recommending we use that again, but just to share with you, they created political parties, Christian democratic parties. They created Catholic Christian trade unions that competed with the secular liberal ones and the Marxist one. They were all over the world. And the funny thing is, most of their members turned out to be Muslims in their trade unions. But and they had they kind of parallel structure strategy. They had lots of things you could do and get involved, and the movements and structures they created were very powerful and influenced the transformation of society. It's not clear what the strategy structures or what agency is to be found with this new strategy. I have my own thoughts. I think the creation, for example, I used to be a pastor and a young man. If I were back pastor again today, I would start an eco-village for our parish, for our community. I think getting back to the land, and there is a global eco-village movement going, that the Christian churches should be a part of that. I would especially look to the Orthodox churches for their understanding of theosis and the sacredness of creation. Bartolomeo, the Patriarch of Constantinople, said the fundamental problem with the ecological crisis is the West has lost the sense that nature is sacred. And I would agree with that fundamentally, the recovery of the sacred. But creating alternative infrastructure that would be seeds of a new civilization. For example, eco-villages. I certainly think and I've mentioned this to Cesar a few times, we need an entirely different model of the university as well that could be set up as co-ops too. So we need to start thinking about where can you find agency and structures that carry agency for this new task, if indeed that is the task, to create a new civilization. That a lot of work still has to be done on that, I believe.
Thank you, Joe.
Yeah, I mean, just to go back, I mean, the Catholic social teaching people from the first half of the 20th century, they created the European Union, all kinds of, they created UNESCO, it goes on and on. Tremendous structures that they created. Back off.
Yeah, I think also it's worth mentioning Peter Morin in this context, right? I mean,
Catholic worker in the United States. I believe he's a great resource. I won't go into that now. I wrote a book called Postmodern Ecological Spirituality, and I hold up his model. I don't think Dorothy, and I knew Dorothy Day, fully understood Peter in that sense. I think they thought when he talked about going back to land, going a farm, he was actually using the French word communes, which were villages. I think so. He was talking about recovering the ancient, long-lasting, and quite sustainable peasant way of living that most of the human race had lived in for thousands of years. But he was not anti-technological, because the first thing he did is go to a printing press and make a newspaper. He would go to AI. He would go to the high-tech stuff today if Peter were around very rapidly. So I think the Catholic worker made a mistake in listening to some other theologians who were not on the same wavelength as Peter Morin.
Thank you. Okay, at this moment, I invite a last word from anyone. It can be from our panelists, our audience. Once again, thank you, everyone. First, before we get to the closing, just want to say thank you. From the bottom of my heart, this has been a wonderful conversation, and I wish we had more time. That's my only lamentation tonight. Other than that, thank you for being here, and just want to see if anybody has a last word to leave us with, last thoughts, benediction of some sort.
Cesar, let me just add one 30-second word. In every generation, in our generation, I tell this to the community of churches I serve and the pastors who serve them, that the call to love God and to love neighbor, to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with God is our call, which is the same call as prior generations. And insofar as we utilize technology towards that, then we will be closer to that civilization of love that Pope Leo has described.
I think that's a wonderful way to close out civilization of love and compassion, which once again gets back to Francis, I think, and what he was discussing in terms of getting back to what it means to be human is simply getting in touch with those emotions, right? That are part of us, and so I think that that's crucial there. I see some calls there for a sequel. Perhaps we'll have one to this conversation. I'll have to check with our fearless leader, but thank you so much for your time, your attention. If there are any comments whatsoever, any questions, follow up, please feel free to email us, contact us, and we thank you for joining us this evening and taking time out of your busy schedules to be with us. So thank you for being in the space, and thank you to our panelists.